Welcome, everybody. I'm actually here with Jack Goncalo, and he is a full professor at University of Illinois. And we're just going to have a conversation today. And we're going to start with maybe talking a bit about himself and why he actually does the things that he does. He's got some really interesting creative research on creativity. And then we'll just go from there, see where this all goes.
Sure. So where I'm from, my mother is from Guatemala and my father is from Portugal. And they're both immigrants who met here. And so my last name is actually pronounced Goncalo, because it's supposed to have the circumflex under the C, but I dropped it. So I get all kinds of various pronunciations. But I'm very much a product of two immigrants who came here. And so my path into academia was not a linear one by any means. I grew up in the Central Valley in California, not at that time a very highly educated place. I didn't really know anything about academia, didn't know anything about professors, never met someone with a PhD. I ended up at UC Berkeley as an undergrad. And I
Well,
was,
okay. How'd you get
yeah,
there?
how
That's
did
a
I
big
get
step.
there?
Just yeah.
Well, so I had a, there was a, so I'm an alumni a proud alum of Tracy High School, and they had an international baccalaureate program, which was basically a college prep, who was led by a teacher, Alan Hawkins, who was a history teacher, poured his heart and soul into creating this program, and along with a lot of other really dedicated teachers that I owe so much to, and they really gave me a foundation for being competitive to apply out of the valley and into what is still the premier public school in California, if not the country. And so I owe a lot to a lot of people who were very supportive and encouraging and really valued education.
Yeah,
Uh,
so tell me
so
about did your family value education as well? Was this what was the background of your parents? How did they, why all of
Yeah,
a
so I
sudden?
would say both of my parents absolutely valued education, and it was really not a question of whether I would go to college. It was just a given that I would. My father went to San Jose State and completed a bachelor's degree um, in business, and but he sort of worked his way through, and he came from a very impoverished background in Portugal and kind of came to the U.S. and to the land of opportunity, and he made a great living. My mother was actually in college in Guatemala studying chemical engineering. She was one of two women in her class, and unfortunately was not able to continue her education here because she had to work. And so one of her first jobs was sewing pockets onto Levi's pants. And she also had to sort of work and her way through, and so I was really sort of the beneficiary of a lot of their incredibly hard work. And so I think that in our family, not taking advantage of opportunities was a terrible shame, because so much sacrifice had gone into coming here, that it was really, I felt, on me to make the most of the next step.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure though, right? Like you must have felt like I have to perform, I have to get into a good college. Tell me about that. What was that experience?
I suppose so. I never really thought of it that way. I think I've always been very self-driven. And I would say, starting early on when I got straight A's, I felt the need to keep that up. And I enjoy learning. I always like school for the most part, although we can talk about things I didn't like about it. But I really wasn't, I just felt supported. I really didn't feel as though it wasn't overtly made uh, clear to me that I was being pressured into doing anything. I think it was more of just a value placed on learning and curiosity, and pursuing things that interested me. I think it was there, but I wasn't really meant to feel neurotic about it in any sense.
So then you get into this, you're in this IB program, and I've heard it's very intense.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. And so you're well trained by the time that you got into Berkeley. And what were you taking? Were you taking business? Were you taking
Well, that's the
um
thing. I was one of those, I got good grades in high school, but absolutely none of it interested me. And I was one of those students, one of my teachers called me a grade grubber because I was really like a sort of guided missile looking for an A, but I really didn't care what I learned or what I had to do to get it, but I just wanted an A to get to the next thing. And so I left high school really not knowing what I was interested in. And so my father had a background in business and majored in business. And so I thought, well, that seems practical. And so I chose Berkeley because they had an undergraduate business major. And so I went and I took the introduction to business course and was bored of almost everything but organizational behavior. I hated finance, hated accounting, hated marketing, hated everything, but OB intrigued me. And at the same time, I was taking a calculus class that was a prerequisite for getting into the major. And I ended up getting a grade in that class that didn't allow me to continue. And so it was a C minus. So it was, I mean, it's funny now, but it's the most important grade I've ever gotten in my life in the sense that it really forced me to think about what I wanted to do and not pursue this mindless default option that really didn't mean anything to me personally. But it touched off a real crisis in college where I sort of thought I had my path, at least in the near future, planned, and I didn't. Um, and so I had to choose, I had to figure out what to do. And I think that the figuring out what to do was a process that was messy, and it was nonlinear. And so I went back to the OB section that I had. And I thought, well, what is that basically? It's basically psychology applied to understanding how to manage people. And um, and I thought, well, maybe then psychology is a way to focus on the piece of this that I like and to continue to move forward. And so I switched my major to psychology and sort of went from there.
Yeah, so tell me about this crisis that you went through. How did you handle it? Was it just, you know, we all go through these moments, right? And that's what I'm trying to do a lot with this channel is destigmatize a lot of the feelings that we go through, particularly as creative workers. Or all of the negative emotions that we go through. What was your process in terms of going from, oh, my life is over, I'm a complete failure, to actually picking this discipline of OB?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my life is over kind of it was more of a confusion and uncertainty. And we're talking 25 years ago, but what I remember is a lot of soul searching, walking in the Berkeley Hills, which I don't know if you've been to Berkeley, but they're beautiful and with these beautiful houses. And I did a lot of walking, and I find that that's whenever I reach points in my life when I do that, I get out and I walk around. I didn't sit in my room and contemplate anything. I felt like I got out and I thought, I'm gonna approach this like a process of elimination. I'm gonna try things, and if I don't like it, I'm gonna move on to something else, and I'm gonna keep trying things um, until I figure out what I want. And so I signed up to be a peer counselor because I thought maybe clinical psychology might be of interest to me. And so I was trained to be a peer counselor, and I learned a lot from that. Not the least of which is I have no interest in being a counselor to other people because I felt like it would be more than I could handle. I would, so I tried that. I thought maybe I want to be an HR consultant. So I signed up to work for a college credit union that was on campus at the time. And I was in the HR function. And it was cute. It was this little credit union. It was run by students. So we had a little, different functions. And that led me to an internship at a compensation consulting firm. And I spent a summer doing that. The most boring, mind-numbing horror, I just, okay, so I can check that off the list. So it was a lot of like, I'm just going to put myself out there, try things, and then check things off that I don't like until I find something that really captured my interest. And Didn't find that until I signed up to be a research assistant for a professor in the
And
psychology.
who is that?
His name is Jerry Mendelson, and
Okay.
he's an old school personality psychologist who had done a lot of really important work. And at the time, he was studying goals and strivings, and it was really a methodological project looking at the kinds of content that you elicit from people if you ask them about their goals versus their strivings versus their, I don't remember, aims or different things. And so we got a lot of open-ended responses around that. But the key thing, he said, okay, well, I was entering the data and all this, and he said, you can have the data and do some correlational analyses and, and sort of play around with it. And I became interested in goal conflict and how that correlated with well-being and psychological well-being and other things. And I started to find some correlations, and I put that together as an undergraduate research presentation. And really, at that point, I started to become interested in research in a big way, in the sense that I liked the ability or the opportunity to ask questions and then go out there and test them and have some information that would indicate whether I was on the right track or not. And that really appealed to me. So that started, although I didn't see myself as a researcher just yet, I was still thinking I'm going to be a consultant. I'm going to go into the business world one way or the other. And that gradually shifted as my research and interest sort of grew. But I remember
So
the pivotal moment where I started to think about research, and I was asking, well, what careers are there? And someone said academia. Like, what is that? So I truly didn't know
yeah.
anything about it. And so the first and maybe only office hour I went to was Shelley Zedek's. He's an industrial organizational psychologist, and he was the only IO psychologist on the faculty there. And I went up to him and I went to his office hour and I said, I'm an undergrad, I'm interested in research, and I want to know how do I do what you do? And he seemed kind of confused. He was like, what do you mean what I do? It's like, you're a professor. How do you do that? And he's like, oh, and he's like, well, you need a PhD. And I was like, well, how do you get there? And so it was really this process of sort of asking a lot of naive questions and just trying things and trying to find things that sort of captured my imagination.
Yeah, but it's not at the time though. They weren't naive questions. You genuinely just didn't know, right? Like it's not necessarily, and I guess it's a definition of naive, but I don't want people to feel
Yes, the
like when
definition.
they're listening to this is like, feeling insecure about asking these questions. It's a really peculiar field unless you know people that are in it because it's tight. Like
And as it turns out, a lot of the people I know in academia have academic parents.
yeah, absolutely. I've seen there's a recent study that came out. It was something, I think it's like 70% or 80% of academics have inherited the profession, which,
Well, it makes sense to me. I mean, how would you know about it? It's just a very obscure, weird
it,
profession.
yeah, absolutely. So how would you define it? What would you think about it in terms of what you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it's what we have to fill out every year. It's research, teaching, and service in that order, right? Although that changes as you get more senior. But um, most of my mind, to be honest, is on research in the sense that I'm always open to observing people and um, observing interactions and being open to my next research question. And I started life as a groups researcher. And as a result, I have a really hard time being in a meeting without analyzing the meeting itself as opposed to what's going on. So I notice all these little things about who speaks first and who speaks most often and who cuts someone off and all of these. So I find I'm almost a little bit overwhelmed by these interactions, but I spend a lot of time being very open to talking to people and asking questions. And but day to day, I mean, I tried, it's a mix of things. I think we have to juggle a lot. And so every month I make a to-do list of things and I try to cross things off. And that's really kind of how I navigate my
So I
time.
You're probably trained as industrial psychologist, I guess, with the to-do list. But I
Well,
mean,
what's
I
funny
gave
is I
up on
actually
those.
ended up rejecting industrial psychology. So the other part of the story, so we'll finish like how I got to the beginning, really. I took a seminar from Charlotte Nemeth, who is a social psychologist who studies minority influence and dissent and creativity. And then my interest in research sort of combined with this topic of creativity, and I realized like that's really what I want to do, is what I want to study that. Um, and so I applied to industrial psychology programs, and they really were not interested in creativity at all. And on a whim, I applied to two OB programs. One was at the Harvard Business School, the other at Berkeley. And I happened to get into Berkeley, and there they were interested in things like creativity and culture and norms and all the things that came to be my central area of research. But
And
again, a lot of it is chance.
yeah, so how did you apply then? That's the other thing, right? So you're well on your way at this moment. It sounds like you were doing research in your undergrad with some folks. So obviously that kind of it gives you a bit of a jump up. Um, but what was the process in terms of applying? Did you just kind of, you know, go down the list, or did you actually look at what people were doing?
Yeah,
Um,
so I talked to Shelley Zedek, and he's an industrial psychologist, and I decided PhD is my next step, and IO Psych seems to be the practical applied way I want to go. And so I looked at the top programs and I applied to those. And the department secretary was sending out my letters, because back then it was all on paper and they were on file, and she would, send them in envelopes. And, this is a long time ago. And she was looking at where I was applying, and she made an offhand remark. You realize that the people at the business school do exactly the same thing and make twice more money. And I said, no, I didn't know this. So I wish I had a more elevated explanation for why I ended up in OB. But it was really that one offhanded comment. And I thought, well, I may as well apply to OB, whatever that is, too, because why would I work for half the money? It was really, I was 22 years old. I didn't know anything. And so the one offhand remark, I thought, okay, so I sent in my two applications at the last minute, and one worked out. And ironically, that it came down to the University of Illinois, where I am now, in industrial organizational psychology, versus UC Berkeley at the Haas School of Business in organizational behavior. And I was sort of comparing, and Jenny Chapman, who would eventually be my advisor, had just written an ROB chapter called Corporations, Cults, and Commitment. And it was all about viewing organizations as a kind of social control mechanism that is not unlike what controlling and manipulative cults uses to control people. And given my background and everything, I read that and I was absolutely horrified, like what you would like reading a horror movie. And I thought, like, well, I want to talk to the lady who wrote the horror novel because I think I could really learn a lot. And I think that um, my experiences were such that I really reacted negatively to that, just personally, at the idea that the best way to manage people is to control them and manipulate them and coerce them. And I can understand the argument from efficiency, but as someone who was interested in creativity and had a very big background with in organizations that were very controlling, I'll just say, I had a real reaction to it. And so, and luckily for me, Jenny is a very open, like she likes to debate and argue and question. And we had a great, and still do 25 years later, dialogue around these things. So I chose to go to Berkeley and pursue OB just because it was really more interesting at the time.
So how am I gonna? So one of the things that's really interesting is that at the time was probably that conversation was probably not relevant, right? The way that organizations were viewed is, I mean, there was probably a little bit of counterculture evolving at that point, but now a lot of people are having this conversation, right, in pop culture and what it means to be part of an organization. And it seems like a lot of younger folks are having this conversation of like, do I want to participate in a larger organization or not? So it seemed, back then it was probably very radical, but now it seems
Well,
um
it was, so I also had Barry Staw as a mentor, who was someone who was part of the counterculture movement in the 60s. And his stream of research on escalation of commitment was inspired by his attempt to dodge the draft. And he was kind of this rebel. Um, and so I had the two of them there, and Charlene, who is also all about dissent. And so I had this mix of really brilliant people on both sides of the issue that I could sort of bounce ideas off of. And it was a truly unique set of people in a time to really start thinking about these things. Um, and it was something of interest to me because my view of the Central Valley in California was very, very conservative. I went to a very strict evangelical school, and I was a misfit in every way you can imagine growing up. I was Hispanic among a predominantly white population. I was non-religious among extremely religious people. I hated sports in a sports obsessed culture. I mean, you name it. So I had a whole uh, upbringing being on the margins that I think was the best training possible, better than graduate school in doing what I do now and asking the questions that I ask. So, my reaction to that cult paper was based on that experience of um, where people talk about the importance of person organization fit. Well, I never fit. Um, so there's got to be
You're-
some other perspective on this. And I could see the upsides of fit from afar. I experienced the downsides of misfit up close. And so I had a lot to say about it. And I think that's where um, I was looking for something that would give me the opportunity to do work that's personally meaningful to me. I also had the experience of watching my father work at Intel um, as a middle manager who absolutely hated his job. And he did it purely for the money. And I say this because he told me himself that he hated his job. And I wanted to find something that I didn't hate, that inspired me, that I felt was meaningful to me personally. And so all these things, I think for all of us, we all have our own story that comes together in these weird ways that um, explains why we're attracted to some things and not others, or why we pursue certain questions and not others, and why we persist at some things even though other people might have given up.
yeah, so why is it that it seems like a natural conversation or a natural story of why you were interested in dissent or sort of the negative sides of creativity. um why did you get into that during your graduate school? Do you remember a moment where all of a sudden you started thinking about this?
I
Or was it
do.
just, yeah?
I do remember a moment in undergrad. So I came to Berkeley, like I said, feeling as a permanent outsider, misfit. And the reason I liked Berkeley, still do, is that there's nothing to fit into. Everyone's doing their thing, right? But I didn't feel good about that. I always felt like if only I could fit in, life would be so much easier and so much better and so much happier.
Hmm.
And so I didn't feel good about it. But there was a lecture so Charlene Nemeth gave a guest lecture, um, and she did an activity where she asked, and this is an activity I still do in class even now, where she asked people to deliberate as a jury around a case of a juvenile delinquent who had committed another crime, and the jury was supposed to decide on a scale of 1 to 7: do we treat this juvenile delinquent with pure kindness as a 1, or 7, we should probably consider physical punishment? And there are all scales in between. And most people are at about a 3. Well, we should be somewhat kind, a little bit disciplined. But she told one person before the conversation started, without anyone knowing, pick the position 7 and advocate for physical punishment and hold it as long as you possibly can. And the hostility that ensued and the immediate negative attention directed at the 7, it got to the point where a woman in the group turned to the guy who was advocating for 7 and said, if you think physical punishment is such a good idea, let's step outside and I'll show you what a good idea is. And so she stopped it. And so we had this conversation around, look, you may not like the person who's different from you. You may not agree with them. You may think that what they're saying is utterly repugnant. But the fact is that engaging them in a debate made you think, and it made you sharpen your arguments. It made you think of better arguments, more information on both sides of the issue, and which leads to a more unbiased process. And so the process itself has benefited from this misfit, this outsider, this person who questions things, this person who refuses to conform and go along. And that, I mean, it sounds commonsensical now, but 25 years ago, when I was, 20 years old, feeling like this person who never fit and never understood the value that I could bring as someone who never fit, it was an epiphany, and it completely changed my view of myself, the world, the groups that I'm in, and it really led me toward taking her seminar, actually. And so, to this day, I credit, that moment in among others with really changing my view of what I want to do with my life, which, and I think that perspective underlies almost everything that I do.
So how do you feel like you fit in now even? Is this something that is always with you? I'm gonna be really honest, I never really feel like I fit in. And I've always felt like I've been an outsider even during high school, and I think it's, from things that happened when I was relatively young. I can sort of trace back to when it actually happened. So I never feel like that. And I always want to strive to impress or to fit in as much as I possibly can. Um, does that change? Is this embedded in your personality and who you are?
Well, it's funny. I think that talking about this work and in that perspective, I realized that almost nobody felt like they fit in throughout their life. There were very, very few people who felt, I think, a small minority of people who feel like I'm me and I'm accepted everywhere. And I think most people go through feeling like that. It's just not something we normally talk about. I'm afraid at this point it's very deeply ingrained to the point where I'm really not paying attention to it or care. Um, and I'm also at a point in my adult life where I have the power to surround myself with people and situations that don't make me feel perpetually uncomfortable, as I did when I was younger, where I had to take PE and every day I had to go through the process of being picked second to last, not last because
That's great.
because I didn't smell. There was a guy that was uncoordinated and smelled, and I was second to last. And you're forced to do all these things that I no longer have to do. Like have in my adult life have reached a point where I can choose. And so that's a big deal. And so I don't connect with that feeling every day of my life now, but I do think that it can easily be triggered. And I'm actually prepared. I'm fully comfortable being on the opposite end of a disagreement or taking a minority position or all of these things because I've had practice, to be honest. It's just really
Yeah, yeah. So
not
tell
a
me about then if you're a graduate student and you're going through, because one of the things that's really lonely as a PhD student, you go from, this was my experience, was you had a whole bunch of people around, you had a lot of support, or somewhat
or
support.
not.
You had a group, and then all of a sudden you're like thrown into doing research, and you're by yourself, and you're in your head so much. How do you build that support around you? Is it like an artificial thing in your head? Like, I know I talk a lot to this guy that's in there, and I try to externalize it as much so I see, other people can see that. But what do you do in terms of building this support group so that you can have, a friendly conversation about creativity or your research?
Um, well, one of the, yeah, I mean, the support is one question, but how do you make life bearable? I think, um, Baristov said in a seminar, one of many quotes that I've internalized of his is that the most boring questions are about addressing a gap in the literature. And a lot of his work is about things happening in his personal life that he wanted to make sense of. And I think in particular, as psychologists who study people, we are people ourselves. And so I think finding things that are personally meaningful and get an emotional reaction out of you in some way sort of fuels the fire and keeps you going through the rejection and through all that.
Mm.
In terms of support, in graduate school, I was lucky. Um, at Berkeley, I had a collection of really quirky um, people who were all in the office at odd hours, and we were all night owls. And we used to work late at night and get Jack in the Box at the drive-through at 2 a.m. It was a weird time, and I'm really grateful that I was surrounded by other strange people. And I mean that in the best way. And in
Hopefully
fact,
you
I
didn't get.
married one of them. My wife was my office mate at Berkeley, and is also an academic. And it was a great time. And I don't know how to create, I don't know if I could have created that if it weren't that Berkeley somehow drew that group of people together at that time. Um, and so I think that part of when you're picking a graduate program, you want to pick an advisor that you fit with and who you share research interests with, but also pay attention to the other graduate students. Do you click with them? Do you feel like they're going to be your family in a sense for 4 or 5 years? I'm still in touch with many of them, and there is a real sense of a cohort. And even as Matt Cronin gave a talk a few weeks ago. We were talking about all the PhDs that came out in 2004 and how we've known each other for so long now. And you do get a sense of a cohort who's sort of, moving through this thing together, which I think is kind of a helpful sense to have.
All right, so I'm going to push back just a little bit because this
Yeah.
is something that I struggle with. One of the things that happens in academia is that we're pitted against each other in terms of competition, right? Like there's only so many resources that go along or that are out there, and so there's often this kind of weird frenemy relationship that goes on. How do you deal with that, or am I interpreting things in kind of a strange
Well, I
way?
will say I have friends. I don't have a lot of them, but the people that I do, I have co-authors and who I really I do believe are friends. And I think that and I can think of examples of people in the field, and I'm not going to name names, who are extremely competitive and petty and say rude things. And I think that you will attract that to yourself. Um,
Mhm.
and I have not, to me, it's like my view of my work is that it's revealing of myself. And I wrote a paper about this, that I think that you choose things that are revealing of myself. No one else can do the work I do because no one else is me. And at the end of the day, my work says something deeply personal about me. And I'm going to be able to wrap my articles up in a bow and hand it to my daughter, and she'll know something about me. And that's
Hmm.
all I care about. And so, who's cited more than me or who's published more than me, I have a body of work, for better or for worse. People have done more than me. People are cited more than me. People have certainly are making more than me. But I couldn't be anything other than me. And so I have let go of, you have to let go of this idea that if only I could have done a meta-analysis on leadership and trust, I'd have 15,000 citations. I would also be bored to tears. It would mean nothing to me. That's not, with all due respect to people who do that, there's probably is a meta-analysis, and that's great if that means
Yeah,
something to you,
I'm
right?
sure
But
there is.
I
And
feel like I've always stayed aware of where I come from and what motivates my work personally, and I have sought out people who I get the sense are also doing work that means something to them. And I try to be helpful and I say nice things about people. And I feel like I attract co-authors and friends into my life who are similar, and they're my little collection of friends. And again, I don't have a lot of them. I'm not the belle of the ball. I don't go to academy and I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying my career and I'm enjoying my life, and it is what it is.
Hmm. So tell me about the sort of nakedness of research, and what do I mean by that? This idea, and it's probably ironic because you're one of the only people that are probably very open about this, is like the fact that the research that you're actually doing is very descriptive of who you are, and going into some all of the warts, right? So the way that I've sort of figured this out in the last few years, I used to view myself in terms of strengths and weaknesses, which I hate now. I don't even like that terminology because it's just traits, right? We ascribe the whether it's negative or positive in our mind, or because somebody has told us that many years ago that this thing is inappropriate. Um, so how do you deal with that sort of openness that everybody can see your dirty laundry, I guess, your
Well,
personal thoughts?
but aside from you and your 100,000 followers, I don't think anyone reads and thinks that I'm exercising my demons or I'm recreating childhood traumas or anything like that. Um, I think a lot of people, whether they care to admit to or not, are influenced by who they are and what their experiences are. I think we should all just admit where it comes from. Um, but I do, like, I wrote about, I was inspired to write a paper with one of my students, Josh Katz, about how the creative act is self-disclosing. That when you share a creative idea, it's not a random number generator. It comes from who you are. And I think what that does is it makes the rejection process somewhat more difficult, because it's not just a dry idea you had. It's something that you have shared a piece of yourself. And now, so how do I deal with that? Not well all the time. I mean, I think early on in your career, early on, one time I remember I called my mom, I forwarded my mom an email and said, "This is a rejection letter. I need you to read it to me because I can't." So I've had all kinds of, I mean, I had a paper that took 9 years to publish. It was rejected from 6 journals. Um, but again, I think that I've always had the sense that just because everyone else thinks it doesn't mean that they're right.
Yeah.
And if I believe that I'm onto something that feels truthful to me, the chances are if I persist, it's going to connect with someone else for whom what I'm saying feels truthful to them too. And so I think it's a matter um, of persisting in that regard. But I don't know
But
that
it,
many
but I
busy
also
humans.
think it's pretty normal to go through those experiences. I think the story that is told, whether it being in graduate school or just at conferences, is that there's this kind of idealistic researcher that exists that's out there, but in general, that doesn't exist, right? The normalcy of what we go through is repetitive failure, going through a lot of um, just a lot of moments where you're like just doubtful. It's like, is this for me, right? So that I love the fact that you're open about talking about processing those moments of going through that, and how do
I can talk
you
about lots of those moments.
yeah, so
But
how do you get that? Is it just because you have this determination, you're just painfully stubborn, or
I'm
are
not,
you?
I think I like to think I'm persistent, but I'm not stubborn. So I learn. So I get a set of reviews and I look at, so what are commonalities in the negative feedback? And I assume that if it wasn't clear, it's because I wasn't clear enough. Um, if I always, I don't go back with the same thing over and over again. I try to improve. And I have yet to, I hate to admit this, have a paper that was ruined by the review process. I think that um, the end product has been better, as frustrating and as annoying as it is, that it made it stronger. And I really trust the process in that way. And I also don't take it personally. I've been a negative reviewer myself, and I assume that someone's going to be reading my review and thinking that I'm a jerk or whatever, or not understanding. Well, but I do the best that I can. Um, so I try not to take it personally, although sometimes it's hard. I never try to guess who my reviewers are. I think that's a fool's errand,
Mm.
because you're never going to know, and it just makes it feel personal. It's like, oh, I knew so and so hated me this whole time. Maybe they do, I don't know, but I don't know. So there are things that I try not to do. Um, and another thing that Baristow said, a couple of things. One is he said, once in a while, there's a mistake in the review process and something interesting gets published. Um, and so
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I think there is. And
Yeah.
if you want to do incremental research where you take an existing thing and you add a moderator, or you say, oh, this thing that we know of works, unless you have a controlling supervisor. There's a whole industry of that. If you want to say something provocative, be my guest, but you're going to have to be prepared for the fact that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I
But
had this experience at OBHDP recently with a paper where my colleagues and I, Verena Krause and Carmine Tadmore, we pursued this idea that thinking about God makes believers less creative. Well, if you're going to make a claim like that, you have to understand that your reviewers are going to be, at least some of them are going to be believers, and they're not going to want to hear it. And we went through 5 rounds of review before we finally got it through. And at the 5th round, the reviewer said, and I'm shocked that this person was as open as they were, that I'm only being extra critical of this paper because normal people are going to find your findings to be disturbing.
yeah,
Um, fair enough. I mean, I didn't know that I was abnormal. I mean, I'm only dimly aware of my abnormality. I just thought I was making what I thought was a fairly obvious point, but be prepared. And I think that that's why they make tenure, is so that we can, if you get tenure and you're still doing boring incremental research, then you're wasting your opportunity.
it is. So that's a good point, though. I mean, you're making so many good points that are in my mind. But this is a good point of thinking about truthfulness versus the current social norms that we have, or fitting in with what everybody likes. And I guess, I mean, that's the general story of what you're saying, is that you don't fit in, but then there is a considerable amount of pressure to fit in, either within the tenure system, and sort of checking off the boxes of getting these publications to become full, or becoming prestigious so and so at X university, or the ideas that you choose. And that's a pretty far out there idea. And I kind of agree with the reviewer. I think the reviewer, normal people are going to read this and going to be upset, whether it's truthful or not, right? So um, how do you deal with that? Is that because there's a lot of great
I hate to
ideas.
admit it, is that part of me is excited by that because I know that I'm onto something. Because if I'm saying something that doesn't offend anybody, or doesn't strike you as surprising, or doesn't make you want to argue with me, then what's the point?
Yeah.
And if I think if your papers are sailing through and being accepted at the first round, maybe you're not saying anything interesting. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, it's easy, but so I'm this goes back to you were talking about my family and my roots, but my grandmother barely spoke English. She spoke some English, but she used to call me in Spanish all growing up a sin vergüenza, which I never knew what that meant, and I never bothered to ask until I got to college and I took an anthropology course, and the professor wrote the word sin vergüenza on the board. And it turns out, and I was like, my grandmother used to call me that. And he said, well, that's not good because it means shameless. It means like a shameless person. And when you exist in a culture that controls people through guilt and shame, someone who can't feel that is incredibly dangerous. And so I think that there has to be a part of you that just isn't ashamed of, like, reviewer two hates me, so what? I'll catch you at the next one. I mean, I'm really, I guess I do have a very rebellious kind of um, element to me that, sort of keeps me going when I get pushback.
So, but I think it's also really important because you're getting at more truthfulness of what is, what actually goes on. So one of the things that we hear so much is about creativity in terms of it's got all these positive outcomes, and that we should be encouraging creativity. But then I think about, like, what is it that most people do? They're very conformist, right? And it's scary doing anything that's creative and getting out there and saying things that are, you know, far enough from the core, that the core ideas that we have, that they're easy to be chastised, right? There's this saying, and I think it comes from like New Zealand or someplace over there, where it's tall poppy syndrome, right? You don't want anybody to get too high on their, and feeling good about themselves, so you got to cut off the tops
Yeah,
of the
or
poppies.
the nail that stands out gets pounded down.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a fascinating thing of how you get more at truthfulness, I guess, is what you're saying. And sometimes the truth is not always fun, right? As researchers, in fun in the sense that it's fun and it's energizing because it's different and interesting. But sometimes it touches upon how we actually think about the world,
I
a
think
little
it's
more. Oh,
I think it's
go
also
ahead.
important to maintain a sense of humor about this,
Yeah.
and playfulness, and like asking questions like, why not? And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'll put a paper out there that won't replicate. I believe also in the process of being vetted by the community um and so forth. But I think you have to retain a sense of humor about this whole process as well, which kind of helps.
So I love what you're saying. There's two things that I've picked up from what you've been saying so far. The first thing is you got a lot of humility, which I think is super important, right? And to not get caught up in all of the games that we play. Um, in whatever status market that you're in, or whatever part of life that you're looking at, that humility is super, super important. And then the other thing is you're very astute on picking up things. There is a natural, you have intuition that I think a lot of people don't have, which I
But
think
I
is,
think this goes back to when you're forced to be on the outside, you're forced to pay attention. Um, as opposed to when you're in it, you're not really in a position to really observe how things work. And so I actually have come to really appreciate my outsider sort of bent on the world, in terms of helping me do what I do. But I also think, another rejection story. I submitted a paper to psychological science and um, received an almost immediate desk reject. It was an auto response coded to my name. It's like Goncalo. It's like, so I thought, and the feedback was interesting. You don't get much feedback in these desk rejections, but what they said was like, we've published enough on the antecedents of creativity and we're no longer interested in this line of work. And so that's basically everything I do. And I thought, antecedents, well, what if I just flip it around and give you something on the consequences of creativity? And so that led me to think about, well, what do we know about the consequences of people being in a creative mindset? And so that one rejection letter generated several papers in a stream of research I'm still working on. And I'm not the only one who's ever looked at consequences, but it made me really think of it from a different perspective. So, sometimes these negative experiences can, if you approach it with the right attitude, you can sort of profit from them in a way.
Yeah, so the way that I often try to think about it, and it's painful and I hate it, to be very honest, but I also think about it as kind of dancing, right? Or judo. where somebody throws something bad at you, and or somebody does a misstep, and then you have to figure out how to use that misstep against them, if that makes sense, right? Where you're, or to work with them, right? Where you are thinking about, okay, this is the way, this is what the audience, this is the way that the world actually thinks about things right now, right? Because they're probably some of the more astute people in the world, that are thinking about this. This is how they're thinking about it, and you got to think, okay, that avenue is not going anywhere. So then we got to figure out, how do we flip it around, um, and leverage it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of it. I mean, the dance is kind of a, I think of the review process as a dance,
Hmm.
um, and a negotiation. And, there's an art to that too, like, writing a response letter. Thank you very much for all of your wonderful points. I'm grateful for the opportunity to respond to your critiques because I think it's made the work so much stronger. I mean, we've all written stuff like that, whether we believe it or not. But yeah, I like the whole dance metaphor. I think there's a lot to that.
All right, so tell me how you actually get a job if you are, going along this much harder route than following the games that we play, where you are actually developing your own identity, um, that you have something to say, and maybe not everybody is going to find it and find it enjoyable. How do you, go
I
about building your career?
I think what I've proposed is a higher risk path, and I've been lucky. So when I left graduate school, I had only two interviews, and one of which yielded a job, only because their first choice turned it down. And so I barely got a foot in the door in this field. And I think that I'm just someone who, if you gave me a list of things that I had to do to have a career, I'm not sure that I'm the kind of person who could just do that.
Hmm.
And so for better or for worse, I'm stuck doing what makes sense to me, whether that, and I just don't know any other way. And so I remember when I was an assistant professor talking to my department chair about how to get tenure, and she was saying things like, you need to publish in this journal and you need to go to lunch with this crowd every Friday because they're important. And I did none of that because it didn't make sense to me. I would just rather sit at my desk and do my work rather than go to lunch. And I would rather publish where my work is likely to receive a relevant audience as opposed to this place. And I just did what I did. And I don't know that that would work for everybody. It's not advice that I can give people. I think if you need that kind of advice, then that's not the path that you want to take. Whereas I remember there was a advice column for men's fashion, and someone wrote in and said, "Oh, I noticed that it's fashionable to wear women's sunglasses. Do you think that I could pull it off?" And the response was, "If you're the kind of person who has to ask, then no, you cannot pull it off." And I think there's a little bit about that. I'm not the person to give, you know, maybe my graduate students who, they all have jobs actually. So I don't know, maybe I'm not terrible at giving career advice, but how do you make it? I think this actually segues into a bigger question about the field and how difficult the field is. Um, it, I think things are harder now than they've been, in the sense that um, I think there's more of an emphasis on having a large number of publications rather than doing interesting work, and counting publications rather than reading dissertations. Um, um, using the UT Dallas list,
Mm,
as opposed to encouraging a programmatic stream of research that's interesting. I think we've done a lot of things to provide metrics that get us out of actually having to read work and decide what's interesting or not. And I think that my generation may in part be responsible for that. I have the sense that the Charles O'Reilly, Jeff Pfeffer, Barry Staw, so forth generation, um, I think you could get a job with just an interesting dissertation and people actually read and people had taste. I don't think that that's uniformly the case now.
Hmm,
And I worry that there's too much of an emphasis on, we would only interview someone with 3 publications. So here's the red line.
hmm.
And there could be a diamond in the rough. Or journal editors who count votes instead of actually reading the paper and deciding that only one reviewer liked this, but I like it too. And so let's develop this. And as opposed to just siding with okay, if 2 people hated it, one person liked it, so the votes are in. We don't need editors for that. I could get, my poodle could be editor. I mean, I'm pretty sure she can count at that level. Um, and so
There
maybe
is.
this is
I was just.
maybe and actually I had a conversation with a colleague who said, Jack, maybe you wouldn't make it nowadays. And I'm like, you're right, maybe I wouldn't. That's possible. I don't know. Maybe a thing like me wouldn't make it past go. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't have the answers to these things, but I do remember being in graduate school and attending these workshops where, the PhD workshops at Academy where they tell you
Mhm,
sort of how to
mhm.
manage your career. And they would spend the whole first, part of the session before lunch saying, you need to follow your interests, and you need to find things you're passionate about, and you all this stuff. And then after lunch, you're like, okay, so let's talk about the trends. And everyone's like, okay, I gotta study, whatever, because that's what gets you a job. I think you got to pick one or the other. You're either a before lunch kind of a person or an after lunch kind of a person, and I think they're both fine. I
Mm.
really do, and I think that people pick what's right for them. And if I were an after the lunch, let's write down the trend and just do that kind of a person, maybe life would have been easier. I'm not, I can't, I'm not capable of it. Because for whatever reason, um, I would probably get bored and do something else.
So that's a fantastic place. I would love to talk to you more, but I know that you're very busy. And we could carry on the conversation if you want, but we're at
I'm
one
fine.
hour.
I'm fine carrying on.
Okay,
More
okay.
questions. The only caveat is that if Zoom cuts us off suddenly,
Yeah, I don't know what the rules are with it.
because I made it an hour meeting, but if it were going to cut us off, it would have done so 2 minutes ago. So I'm not sure.
So how do you so I love this. A lot of what I try to get people to think about is just like be themselves. That's what I'm screaming at. It's more screaming at me, like my younger self and maybe me now is just be yourself no matter that there's all these pressures to conform. And it kind of keeps you away. There's guardrails when you're being yourself a little bit, right? So then you don't go into some things that you don't necessarily like. In the conversations that are going on right now, in terms of you know sketchy science, however you might define sketchy science, that there's guardrails. If you are not playing by the game as much. Those guardrails of this is who I am, and regardless of these outcomes, this is what's going to happen, and I'm okay with that. I think that is a nice way to think about the world. How do you train or get people to think about just be yourself? And if it doesn't work out for you, because I mean, I study failure and negative outcomes and all that kind of stuff. So I do realize I'm very realistic that it doesn't work out for many people.
But I,
How?
but I think that not being yourself can also end in failure. And I'd
Uh-huh.
rather fail being myself than fail being somebody else. And the fact is, you're right. A lot of people won't make it at this. It's not an easy thing. And, a lot of
Mm.
people think that our jobs are cushy, that we have all this free time and, we teach a little bit and, my parents never understood my job. They were like, what do you do with all your time? It just seems like you teach 3 hours a week and then what do you do with the rest of it? It's hard what we do. And I've seen a lot of people that I started out with uh, leave for industry or other things where it's more structured. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't. In the top journals reject 95% of everything they get. So I'm
Hmm.
not so sure that playing the game and trying to do research other people find interesting um, will necessarily boost your chances because I don't think that I don't think that the process is orderly enough or predictable enough to guarantee an outcome
But I
if
also,
you only do this.
so one thing that you're saying, and I'm just reading into this, and I would love to change this, is that for people that feel like this is not working out for them, that going into industry is perfectly fine, and it's a wonderful career choice to actually do that. How do you get people to, if they do choose to go into one thing or the other, um, how do you get them to sort of reconcile that they're okay with going into industry? I think that's part of the problems that we're having right now, is that I think people are so guilted to feel like they have to stay within the research careers, that they forget that there's a whole great big world out there. What do you tell students, what do you tell your colleagues that are
Well,
thinking of
I
going
had this
into?
conversation with an assistant professor a couple of years ago who got a very lucrative job in industry and was able to live where he wanted to live and end his dual career issue. Um, and he was running me through all this, and I was like, so why do you feel so bad? Like, who are you trying to please so much that you would give up all of these great things to stay in something that is objectively worse for your life? Who are you trying to please? And does the person you're trying to please really care as much as you think they do? Or are they living their life um, and they're gonna, and they don't remember who you are as soon as you close the door to their office and move on?
Mhm.
Who are you trying to please? And I am very aware of the fact that I only have one life. We all do.
Mhm.
Time is ticking, and I think if you're spending your life doing something that makes you miserable to please somebody else, whether it's your advisor or whether it's probably your advisor, to be honest, who's putting this guilt on you. I think you can explain to that person that here, this is my life and this is what I want to do. Sometimes people are going to accept your life choices. Sometimes they aren't, but in the end, if you're happy, who cares? I mean, this is really, or maybe this is the theme of the whole thing. Who
Mhm.
cares? Um,
Mhm.
what is pleasing people really going to get you over and above the possibility of having a happier life outside of academia, if that's what's for you? Now,
Mhm.
I have personally, I've never had that conflict because I'm useless for anything outside of academia. I would be horrible. I would be, so I've never had to face that because no one would pay me money to do anything outside of writing papers and doing what I do because I'm too weird. Um, so it's a little bit easier, but I think the real question is, well, the guilt is coming from the possibility of not pleasing someone. Who is that person and why do you care so much? I think that's the real question to ask.
Yeah, yeah. Probably for me, as I was born and raised in a very Catholic family, so there's lots of guilt. Um, that comes from anything. So you were mentioning about being in a dual career family and having that dual career problem. Um, so you and your spouse both are academics. How are you able to navigate that?
Oh gosh, it's been challenging. So I remember I arrived here and a graduate student said, "Oh, I need your advice on dual career issues because I'm about to marry my husband who's a professor." And I was like, "You want my advice? Don't do it." But gosh, that's a whole nother
Then maybe that's another episode.
topic. Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
so it's a good question. I think we've also had to make very unconventional choices. I mean, so we got married, and she had finished a year earlier than me and went to Georgetown, took her first job. I stayed in Berkeley to finish my degree and without a job yet. And so it was complete uncertainty as to what was going to happen. And I remember my grandmother at the wedding, who was very Catholic and conservative, and she was like, "Let me get this straight. You live together before you get married, then you get married, then you live in a different state. She doesn't take your name. She does all this, and like, what is happening here?" And I think that we had to deal with a lot of what is happening here. This isn't traditional or right in
Uh-huh.
choices. So we lived apart for 3 years early on and commuted, and we held off having kids until later than average. And we eventually both landed jobs or she landed a job at Cornell where I was. And we've um, we've taken the strategy of this is really one career, and we've prioritized them equally for better or for worse. And
Hmm.
but it's hard. I mean, I think you, as a dual career couple, you have to be aware of the fact that um, that you're going to be viewed as a two-body problem, that there are going to be jobs that one of you could get that the other one won't be able to get, and therefore you might not be able to pursue it. Um, there are costs involved for sure, and so I think that that's just something to be aware of. Um,
Yeah, but I also think too, I mean, it goes back to the same pressures that we go through, and the same sort of theme is like, I always, you got to be able to give the world the middle finger. That's the way, and just live your life and be okay with the fact that, hey, if for this season of my life, maybe for 10 years, I have to take a bit of the I'm not going to be as productive, or I'm not going to get this sort of things checked off, then that's fine too, right? Like, I think that's where it means growing up as an adult and realizing that you have to make these sort of tough choices as a family is such an important part. I think that that's what it means to build that wall, those boundaries between you against the rest of the world, and then you just have to be okay with that.
well, I mean, the thing that people also don't talk about, that life happens. And I'm someone who I like to have at least a publication a year, uh, uninterrupted. And that's just, if I don't publish in a year, I feel as though I'm not earning my paycheck, and there's an incredible amount of guilt. But I had the experience where my father got sick, and he had brain cancer and passed away. So he got sick and he passed away within a year. And then we moved to a different state, and my mom became a widow and all this. And lo and behold, I had a gap in my publication record. And so I had to be kind to myself as a human being and think, and it's crazy to think that I would be so hard on myself as a full professor and look at there's a gap, as though I'm up for tenure, and tenure was years in the rearview mirror. And still I had to say, look at everything I had to deal with, and my family is intact, and we survived this horrible thing. And the
Hmm.
worst thing is that I have a gap. And still I had to really talk myself out of feeling really, really bad about it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
embarrassed, and feeling as though I'm not earning my keep. And maybe I can't, maybe I lost it, maybe I can't do, all these things are just ridiculous. But there are human thoughts that people have,
yeah,
and we all go through, inevitably we have children, we have parents, people, we have illnesses and all kinds of things that we deal with. And I think it's hard to be kind to ourselves sometimes. But
so what would you like to leave to the audience at this moment? Is there anything that we should talk about?
God, we covered a lot. I feel like this was a therapy session. I should check.
I know. I mean, it's super, it's just fun listening to these stories, to be honest. And I'm deeply appreciative of everything that you've said and disclosed. And I think like the real conversations are the things that are, particularly when we have the internet now and we have access, people can watch us all over the world, for better or for worse, but it gives people more, inspiration to do things that are courageous, but also gives people sort of that feeling that, hey, we're just normal. Um, we're trying to make life happen just like everybody else. And it's a disaster, but
Well,
we're
I think
trying.
what you're doing is really a service because you're getting people to talk about life behind the curtain.
Hmm.
Um, and I think we tend to look around and think that everyone else has it figured out but me, and so and so has published more than me, and all of this, and what's wrong with me. And I think that if we're being honest, everyone has struggles. They may
Hmm.
take different forms, but we all have struggles, and people are more invested in hiding them than talking about them.
Hmm.
So maybe we should think more about ways of in the field sharing failures. Like, let's publish our rejection letters. Let's have a running record of how
I
many
love
times
that. I love that.
a paper was rejected before it was published. And a lot of times all you see is the end product. But if I had a section in my CV that said not only this was published here, but it was rejected from these 6 places, maybe people would have a different view of the process. I mean, I definitely am very open with my students about all of my failures, my rejections, my dead ends. The one of the first papers that I ever sent to present at Academy was rejected while it was a revise and resubmitted OBHTP. And it's currently my most cited paper, but it was rejected at the Academy. So
Which
it
is, so
doesn't
for
always
those,
make sense.
yeah,
It doesn't
that's
always
like
make
a,
sense. It doesn't have to make sense.
yeah.
And you're not the only one dealing with the fact that this career comes with an incredible amount of uncertainty and rejection and a fair amount of feeling as though you're the only one going through it. And I teach, I mean, that's basically pluralistic ignorance. I mean, I teach this stuff where everyone else thinks that everyone else has it figured out, but in fact, no one does. Um, I think we correct that by just being honest,
Hmm.
and what could happen.
I love it. So Jack, I do appreciate your time. And this is going to help out, or maybe it won't, right? It might help out, or it might not do anything. But I think it'll help me out, and I think it's going to help out a lot of other people over the years as this sits up on the internet. So
Hey, thank you. It was great talking to you.
yeah, it was super, super fun. Let's stay in touch.
Yes, please. Take
All
care.
right, take care. Bye.